Hey, welcome back to WCHS, ladies and gentlemen. This is Social 20, and tomorrow we have our A2 final exam. And I want to make sure that some of you do very well. Some of you I don't care about at all. I think you know who you are. But some of you I do want to see move on to bigger and better things. Some of you I just want to see move on. But let's see what you can do to prepare for an A2. Keep in mind that all A2 sources in grade 10, in grade 11 this year that we have now, or in grade 12 next year or summer school this year, it's always going to be introducing you a some kind of position about the theme of the course. Globalization was the theme last year. This year it's nationalism. Next year it'll be ideologies, connecting with role of government, role of citizens. And not only will it be about that theme, but it often presents some kind of issue, some kind of challenge associated with the theme, and it may explicitly or implicitly provide a goal and a solution. So that's what we have to identify. The first step of your A2 is an analysis of source. Although it's only worth 6 of the 30 marks, if you end up performing in a limited way of the analysis, then you cannot score above an S in any other category. So that ends up capping your paper at 58%. So I would say that I overteach the analysis so that none of my students fall low of an S. So let's make sure that we can understand how to maybe generally understand the source, but even more so, maybe get to an adept unpacking of it, where you're very specific and purposeful about how you're breaking it down, and hopefully at some point maybe show some insight. Maybe show that you have some precision in terms of your analytical ability. So as we look at the analysis step, when you get your source, the first thing that I would suggest to do is read it over as a holistic quote. So read it one time, and then go back and dissect it with a highlighter. And highlight key terms. Key terms like nationalism if it's there. Key terms that help you identify the values, the assumptions, and ultimately the perspective that's being presented to you. These are the key terms that you have to break down in order to analyze the source. So for example, not only are you going to pull key terms like maybe strength, but you might want to look at the significance of the usage of those terms. We have studied an entire cast of characters, and there's no consensus surrounding the terms like strength. So if the source uses something like strength, so hypothetically it might say that in order to achieve strength, nations must, then you have to unpack the conversation and the controversy surrounding the idea of strength. To a ultra-nationalist, a fascist like Adolf Hitler, strength might mean this. But to a nationalist and a liberal-minded person like Jefferson, strength would be identified with these roles of citizens or roles of government or values within society. So as you begin to unpack the source, you identify these key terms, but for the key terms, in order to get past that S, you need to unpack the significance of their usage and how that there might not be a consensus around ideas like conformity or unity or division or hostility. That to some, maybe these terms might be not a negative thing. So I asked you to consider the use of strength. That's kind of a hint for tomorrow's paper, that you will be wrestling with the idea of, what makes a nation strong? Under what circumstances is nationalism adding to the strength of a nation? And I think that you should be able to think back to Hitler's domestic and foreign policies to be able to really envision and quantify that. But as you also unpack the key language of the source, I'd ask you to consider their tone. So first thing in red here was for you to give me some examples of tone. So examples of tone include what? What's one example, yeah? Serious. Why so serious, son? Yeah, you could add the Joker, right? It could be a serious tone, Or the opposite, it could be the opposite of serious, a very comical tone. I'm not sure that I've ever seen that on a source, but perhaps. Any other tones? Yes. Aggressive. It's an aggressive tone. Anything else? Yes, sir. Positive. There's a positive tone, a optimistic tone. Aggressive could be seen as also maybe a combative tone or a divisive tone. Any other tones? Yes, sir. Fatalist. And again, somebody asked during the brainstorming part, what does fatalist mean? That's when the voice behind the source only sees the negative to the point that they see it leading to death, right? That everything is so bad, it's going to lead to the demise of the nation, the demise of the people within the nation. Very fatalist. Any other ideas? Yes? So I heard realist. And what was the other one? Romantic. So under realist, you could add things like social Darwinist. You could add the idea of Otto von Bismarck and his realpolitik could be associated with the realist undertones. Not saying realpolitik is social Darwinist, but both of them are meant to have some kind of basis in nature or what is advantageous. You might have a sarcastic tone, a cynical tone. You might have an alarmist, sounding an alarm, right? And if it is an alarmist tone, then you might want to consider who is meant to hear the alarm and how are they meant to respond. So an alarmist tone, a romantic tone, a realist tone, a fatalist tone, a positive tone, optimistic tone. Tone about what? Tone about nationalism, right? So how are the words being used so that we can identify a perspective on nationalism? And tone is one way to find that perspective. Aside from strength, are there any other big rock terms that we used often in association with nationalism that you anticipate seeing on the source tomorrow? So one way to prepare for the paper is to kind of do some brainstorming. What are some other terms that we've seen? Yes, sir. So sphere of influence. So sphere of influence is very specific language, right? So it depends upon how general I want the source to be. This is a final exam. So often on a final exam on an A2, the language might be general enough that it allows you to talk about the French Revolution. It allows you to talk about the long 19th century. It allows you to talk about the causes of and the events of and the consequences of World War I, World War II. It allows you to talk about the Cold War, the interwar years. It allows you to talk about Hitler's fascism, Stalin's USSR. It allows you to pick and choose. So sphere of influence may be too specific. Yes? So if the course is about nationalism, the course is also about internationalism, ultranationalism, supranationalism, and you could even break terms down like nationalism or internationalism down even more. There's liberal nationalism, there's ideological nationalism. Often words like that may be implicit, not explicit. That they're not going to just give away that we need to embrace internationalism to save the world. It might use words associated with internationalism or values associated with internationalism like cooperation or collective responsibility among nations. Any other key terms that you anticipate that you might see? So, yes. Yeah, so contextually, the source might be using things like the UN or NATO as a backdrop. Very specific sources like that, often a part of an A1, right? In an A1, we had our A1, it had NATO in there, it had some reference to the UN. In A2, the language is, again, a little more broad so that you can talk about different parts of the course. So I'm not ruling out the connection to UN or NATO, but it may be a more general statement. General, almost vague, to the point that it forces the student to reveal something about the course through the language. Because if I just put in there, NATO, then it really tightens up that essay, and it does some of the unpacking for you. So after you have identified the key terms, after you identify the significance of the use of those terms, including their tone, leading to a perspective about nationalism, then the next step of your analysis is to look at, are there any assumptions that the source is making? So an example of an assumption might be nationalism's good, or nationalism's bad, or that nationalism can work under certain conditions, or nationalism doesn't work under certain conditions. It might have values associated with it. It might value conformity, might value obedience to the state. When we are announcing these values and assumptions, it's another opportunity to specifically or precisely connect them back to individuals of the course like Gentile and Sorel and Schopenhauer, and show me that you actually understand the course. So if you just highlight that the source provides pro-nationalist values, well, you either have incompletely or generally identified that. If you connect what value and connect that to a specific person from the course, now it's more sound, specific, and maybe even precise. There's a reason why S is the most common mark, because people generally get it. But can you go to the next step and show some kind of precision? So assumptions like promoting a shared identity, related issue 1, will create some kind of division and eventually lead to conflict and hostility. So this idea is, if we have the state, the government promoting a collective national identity, that might lead to the marginalization of some that maybe look different or think differently, and therefore create conflict between us and them and lead to hostility. That might be an example of an assumption that you could unpack. Or a related assumption to that assumption might be that even if it does create division, conflict, and hostility, the source might be assuming that we should avoid those things. There are many that would argue that it's through division, conflict, and hostility that your nation might get stronger. That in order for the proletariat to overcome the wheel that is history, this cycle of class conflict, they have to engage in that class conflict with the bourgeoisie and overcome them through violence. That by avoiding hostility, they'll never be able to correct the class warfare that they find themselves in. So when you identify the assumption, you can also identify some of the underlining values, roles of citizens, roles of government, purpose of one's life that are part of that assumption. Once you're identifying the assumptions and values, you can begin to unpack the idea of division of society. That there is a voice behind the source, and there would be proponents of that perspective, people that would agree with it, but there will also be opponents of the source, people that may not share the assumptions or share the values. Maybe there's some that value inequality. So if the source is saying that we need harmony in society, fascists may disagree with that. That we don't want harmony among different ethnic groups. That it's not our purpose of our life to have harmony with those of other nations. It's the purpose of our life to strengthen our own blood nation at the expense of theirs, and ultimately cleanse our territory of them, so that we have a nation of blood and soil. So you can identify values like conformity, collective responsibility, service to the state, or the opposite, values of individualism like uniqueness and self-reliance, and the idea that service to the state is optional, not mandatory. Can we offer evidence to further the perspective? Those that elevate the mark from an S to a P, F to an E often identify the perspective on the page, but they offer evidence that might be used to promote it. That the voice behind the source would point to events like this, this, and this to show that this assumption is correct. Or the voice behind the source might point to events like this and this to show that this value is a key cornerstone of a society if the society is going to last. So by offering evidence to further the perspective, you offer yourself a chance to show some kind of insight into what the perspective is. So again, we're not going to take too much time to do these steps, but something that I'd ask you to do before a test is say, what are some assumptions about nationalism that we've seen this year, throughout all this history that we've studied, and by anticipating them, we might be ready to deal with them. When we studied ideologies, each of those ideologies are based on assumptions about the purpose of the state, the role of citizens, the purpose of government, and an essay in A2 gives yourself a chance to talk about and reveal those assumptions, including the nature of mankind. Identify the goal of a source. So the goal may be explicit. In order to survive, a nation must do this. What is the goal for a nation to survive? Or the goal may be implicit. It's not actually stated, but it's implied. We have to infer what's there. So identifying the goal and identifying it as either explicit or implicit is a step of your analysis. And again, once we see the goal, can we offer evidence to further the goal? Connecting it back to nationalism along the way, but also highlighting the division of society as not everyone would agree with this goal. In order for a nation to survive, supranationalists might want nations to not survive. Supranationalists want the concept of nationalism to give way to supranationalism. They want the borders of the world to disappear, not to be strengthened. Another step that often can highlight how much you really understand the source, once you unpack the problem within the source, the issue connected to nationalism, you can make statements like, if left unaddressed, from the perspective of, and add somebody from your cast of characters, the issue of national survival or disunity or whatever could lead to what? What's a worst case scenario? So far, we've analyzed the source by looking at key terms, and as we look at them, we look at their usage. How is the usage of them connected to a tone and a perspective connected to nationalism? After you do that, you talk about the assumptions and values on which the source is based. After you do that, you talk about the goal of the source. Ultimately, the source should provide a path to achieve the goal. Much like the goal itself, the path may be explicit. In order to achieve this, nations must demand obedience from their citizens. Or the path may be implicit. When you identify the path, do identify whether it's explicit or implicit. But there's also going to be a division of society around that path, around the solution to overcome the obstacle. Is it plausible? Is it rational? Is it based upon any misconceptions that some might identify as maybe dangerous? So I would suggest to you that as you unpack the path, and the path to achieve the goal is the key linchpin of that source. This is how we're going to achieve survival of our nation, or this is how we're going to unite our nation. As you unpack that part, do consider the voice of opposition. Offer evidence to further the perspective is a recurring theme here. So what might be evidence that path may work? And as you're doing that, you might want to look at domestic and foreign policy of leaders that we've studied. The Hitlers and the Stalins and the Mussolinis and the Robespierres and the Otto von Bismarcks and the Cold War leaders like Gorbachev and Reagan, and we had FDR, we had Truman, we had Stalin again. He comes up a lot. Identify any conditions provided attached to the solution. So, is the solution conditional? Are they saying that in order to do this, we have to do this, but it's only possible if this? So that's the first step of the A2 response. You have to analyze the source. This is meant to take you 15 minutes because the entire process is meant to take you 80. But you have tomorrow's class, a 75-minute class. At the end of tomorrow's class, your analysis is locked down. You can't go back and add to it. But tomorrow, you should also be able to develop a thesis statement. And tomorrow, you should also be able to begin to build your body. Because if you don't do all of that, you're going to run into time issues on Monday. So let's talk thesis. Your thesis needs to be your response to the assumptions, the claims, the arguments within the source. So as you highlight the source, highlight the key arguments, highlight the claims that they're making, and you need to respond to them. Do you agree that, some kind of collective identity creates disunity? Do you agree that disunity leads to hostility? Do you agree that hostility will lead to the death of the nation? Are these assumptions that you defend, or are there assumptions that you're going to argue against? And often when you create your thesis statement, you take those assumptions within the source, and you might agree with some and disagree with others. And that's how ultimately your thesis statement begins, like, although, a national identity can lead to disunity, it can also lead to unity. Therefore, the path to national survival must and then provide your solution to the problem within the source. Now, we could stop this brainstorming at that point, but it's the next part that really will define the body of your paper. And again, the analysis is worth 6 of 30 marks. So 1/5, 20%. The body is worth 80% of your mark. So you can do a great job on analysis and still be a little disappointed with your end result on your paper. So in order to strengthen your body, not knowing the source in advance for tomorrow, but you will have the weekend with the source in mind, but there is something you can do today to get ready to respond to it. Nationalism's on trial in this essay. It's as simple as that. When is nationalism good? When is nationalism bad? When should we promote it? When should we not promote it? You need to prepare arguments and precise evidence attached to those arguments so that you can respond to that topic. So, to what extent, under what circumstances, is nationalism a positive force? You could have a body paragraph that says nationalism is a positive force when it creates national unity and solidarity. That could be your topic sentence. It's an argument. An argument that you would link back to your thesis statement. Within that paragraph, you're going to be tempted to just go to historical evidence. But in that paragraph, you have a responsibility to show me that you understand the theory of the course. This is where you put in your cast of characters and their ideologies. Nationalism is a positive force when it creates national unity and solidarity. If that's my topic sentence, I'm expecting to see Sorel and Gentile and Schopenhauer and Mussolini. If they're not there, honestly, I should give you a 40%. It looks incomplete. At the end of the course, that should be in that paragraph. It really does look incomplete without that. So we need to consider what arguments and what evidence attached to those arguments that we could use. So I've already got some supporting arguments here. So nationalism is a positive force when it creates national unity and solidarity. For example, nationalism can help post-conflict with the rebuilding of a nation. And then here's a hypothetical unpacking what that looks like, but I have lists here because I need you to have an actual example. If all you say is that nationalism is a positive force because it creates national unity and solidarity, then you have, for example, post-conflict, it can help rebuild a nation. You're still kind of general. I need a specific example. That's why there's a call to action in the brainstorming sheet there. List something. Give me an example. Like, what was a nation that had a conflict, was able to rebuild because they had a shared identity and purpose that transcended that individual differences? Without that, you're still playing around with being general. Here's another argument that could lead to evidence. So, nationalism is a positive force that creates unity and solidarity, which is necessary in response to natural disasters and crises. But give me an example of a natural disaster where a common sense of national identity, strong nationalism, enabled people to overcome that disaster. What's the evidence? What's the precise evidence? Now, to be precise doesn't mean to write 2 pages about Hurricane Katrina. But to be precise is to pick the right example, the right natural disaster or crisis, attach it to a nation that had this common identity and solidarity, and because of that they were able to overcome it. It's not about writing 15 pages. It's about picking the right stuff and precisely, and sometimes in some kind of precision of language too. If you ramble on, it becomes repetitive, and that's a 40. So those are the theoretical and hypothetical, but from the hypothetical, I think you can identify historical and contemporary examples. Nationalism is a positive force when it promotes economic and social development. Which philosophers would argue that? What would economic development look like under Marx's idea of nation, as opposed to what would economic development look like under Adam Smith's idea of a nation? You look at the national pride can drive citizens to contribute to a nation's economic development, fostering innovation and productivity. If you made that claim, that's a nice argument. But now, as a marker, I'd be like, what's my example of an innovation? Give me examples of growth and GDP that happened because of this motivating economic aspect of national identity. Without those GDP numbers or specific innovations, you're still, for evidence, you're wrestling at an S. Promotes economic and social development like social programs and improvement. National identity leads to Canadians identifying universal health care because of this and this. That's a social program, Social 9, Chapter 8. Historical and contemporary evidence. Universal programs, social programs in Canada, you could talk about it historically, but also the contemporary delivery of them. Nationalism is a positive force when it promotes democratic engagement, when it promotes international representation and cooperation, when it promotes global standing and influence, international solidarity, defense and security. But for each one of these, we need those 4 examples from theory, but also from history and contemporary understanding. But what I'd ask you to consider is that not everyone believes that nationalism is a positive force. That just as you use these to say good things, there'd be a voice of opposition. There'd be those that would say that nationalism is a negative force because it creates national unity. That national unity is bad. That nationalism is a negative force because it promotes economic development, and that's bad. Capitalist nationalism's a negative force because economic development comes at an ecological cost. That the externality of global capitalism is the end of Social 10, the old idea of sustainability of this paradigm, and the death of birth and all of those things, the age of stupid that we live in. That promoting democratic engagement's a bad thing because the average voter is an idiot. That we don't want to promote democracy. That's actually going to weaken our government. That it's going to create some kind of popularity contest rather than the most capable. and it's going to promote tribalism among rival parties. Got to think critically to be insightful. So if you end up getting an 80 on your paper and you ask me, how come I didn't get 100? I'd be like, well, you're not insightful. Do you have 4 hours to sit down and look at each thing and see how you could have done it insightful? It's not an easy thing for me to explain a PF to an E, other than the fact that a PF, you specifically get it, you adeptly get it, but you're not giving that insight. Promoting international representation and cooperation is a consequence of having a strong nation. One in opposition might argue, well, doesn't that mean that we should just get rid of the concept of nation and ultimately move to supranationalism? If your best argument that we need strong nations so that we can work with others, why don't we just work with others and stop being different? But there are some uniquely negative forces as well. Nationalism's negative because it leads to exclusion. Again, fascists might say that's a good thing. So for each of these, you could make arguments against them as well. It leads to discrimination. Many people might say discrimination is necessary, that we're not all equally capable. I'm not going to be on the ice for the Edmonton Oilers in the Stanley Cup Finals. They're going to discriminate against me. I'd love to play, but for some reason they don't let me. That's not fair. I should write a letter. I should get someone to write a letter for me. I don't like writing letters. Nationalism is a negative force because it leads to xenophobia, leads to ethnic and cultural supremacy. Again, these are arguments you can prepare to attack nationalism, or you can prepare to say ethnic and cultural supremacy is a positive force. Now, you don't have to take that argument. It's going to be a little harder to defend, but I want you to feel comfortable taking whatever argument you want to defend. It's not the argument that you pick that gets you 100. It's how you defend it. Nationalism's negative because it leads to aggression and conflict, leads to militarism and war, leads to territorial disputes, nationalistic fervor. So if you ask me why you don't get an E for language, I'll be like, well, did you use words like fervor? No, I just said that nationalism leads to aggression. That's S language in grade 11. Suppression of individual rights. Which rights? Give me an example where nationalism suppressed a right. Which right? Freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, ideological freedoms like the right to, your own creed or belief, or freedom of expression. Maybe you're looking at Nazi Germany and the Enabling Act or the Nuremberg laws. That nationalism's a negative force because it leads to or it unleashes authoritarianism. Nationalism's negative, and there it becomes a little more specific. There's an erosion of multilateralism. It might lead to isolationism, might further social division, might create internal conflict, might polarize the people, leading to civil strife. I am handing you the paper here. I'm handing you the building blocks of the paper. And my question for you is, if this is a relay race, and I just sprinted the first 100 meters, and I give you the baton, are you even capable of receiving the baton? Or did you just fumble it because you're on your phone? And now the whole crowd's laughing. Because we've gone from first to last. That's harsh. That's reality. So tomorrow, you're analyzing your source. And then you get a whole long weekend to respond to it. So being that you get a long weekend to think about your response, the bars can be pretty high here. So looking at the document that you guys worked on today, half an hour you guys had to work on it together, the one that you still have access to, do you have any questions you want to ask about the essay?